Okay, we've started recording. All right. Thanks, folks, for joining us today. Good afternoon. We are at the OWEB Water Acquisition Rules Advisory Committee meeting number 4. So we posted materials about a week ago. We'll go around, do introductions. I'll do just kind of quick orientation for the day, and then we'll take any public comment. It looks like maybe we have one commenter with us today. So let's start with introductions. I'll introduce myself, go to RAC members, then go to OWEB staff. I'm Renee Davis. I manage the acquisitions and special programs section at OWEB, and water acquisitions sits within that section. So I'll just go by who I see on the screen. So Steve, could you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Perrette with DEQ's Water Integration Team.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Spencer?
Hi, everybody. I'm Spencer Sawaski. I'm the Habitat Division Deputy Administrator at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Spencer. Jess?
Hi all, Jessica Humphreys. I'm the Oregon Flow Restoration Director for Trout Unlimited.
Great, thank you. Corey?
Good afternoon, Corey Kershane, Water Resources Department Allocation of Conserved Water Program Coordinator.
Thanks, Corey. Anton?
Hello, Anton Kiono with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in their Department of Natural Resources.
Great, thanks, Anton. Shyla?
Hey, good afternoon. Shyla Olson. I'm the District Manager for Wasco County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Great, thanks, Shyla. And Kaylin?
Good afternoon. I'm Kaylin Barter. I'm an attorney with Culp & Kelly LLP, and I'm here on behalf of Client Environmental Defense Fund.
Thank you, Kaylin. We know that Kate Fitzpatrick is going to join late. She's not feeling wonderfully today, so she'll patch in probably in about half an hour or so and just see how she's feeling. And we may or may not have April Snell join us. It is legislative session, so I'm not sure if she's busy, but maybe we'll get her by phone in just a bit. So we'll go to OWEB staff now. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, and before I introduce myself, I did see April join the calendar hold a moment ago. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, so Meg, if you could see if you could help her get over to the meeting, that'd be great. Thanks. But
yes, I sent
hi, everybody. Happy Friday afternoon. And I'm Brian Walcott. I'm the grants coordinator for the Water Acquisition Program and also the Council Capacity Program.
Thanks, Brian. Meg, are you able to introduce yourself? Or are you multitasking right now?
No, I'm good. We're all caught up. My name is Meg Birchfield. I'm with OWEB, and I am a grant support specialist. And I'm basically here in a technical capacity. If there are any issues, people need to be let in, etc. I'm your person. So I will be off camera and muted for the rest of the meeting unless you need me.
Thank you, Meg.
Cheers.
Eric Hartstein.
Hi, everyone. Eric Hartstein, Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
Okay, and Robin, who is a new face with this team.
Hey everyone, I'm Robin Meacher. I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist in the Oregon Ag Heritage Program, but I'm really here to be your note taker. So I will mostly be off camera since I'll be sharing screen, though I will note, Anton, you are very quiet, so I might have to ask you to repeat yourself a few times. But anyone else, that's the only thing you'll probably hear from me throughout.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, and then April, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Apologies for joining late. I had some issues with finding the right link. April Snell, Executive Director with the Oregon Water Resources Congress. We work with irrigation districts around the state.
Great. Thanks for being here, April. Okay, so I'll do brief orientation for our work today, and then we'll move over to public comment. So this is our 4th meeting. There is a chance that this might be our final RAC meeting, but truly this just depends on how we're all feeling about, one, covering some of the last sections of the rule set that we've not yet gotten to. Those should move pretty quickly. And then we do want to do full walkthrough of the earlier sections of the rule set that have seen a fair amount of work, including on some of those substantive topics. So if we are able to wrap things up and you all feel comfortable with the discussion today, then we may not need a fifth meeting. It could be that we decide a fifth meeting is warranted to just circle back on some final edits, and it could be a short meeting. But given that we aren't sure if a fifth meeting is happening, we did hold a little bit of space towards the end of the meeting, about 15 minutes, for Eric Hartstein to walk us through a standard part of any RAC process, which is the fiscal and racial equity impacts discussion. So this is a required part of our ultimate submission to the Secretary of State with rulemaking. So just holding space for that. I will do our best to keep us moving, but definitely we'll protect the time we need to for any discussion among the RAC on some of those more substantive topics. So I think with that, Brian, Eric Hartstein, anything else in terms of framing for the day that we should cover?
Just a quick logistics point. If you do need to leave the meeting, just be careful when you hit the leave button, that you hit the leave button and not the end event button, which is unfortunately right next to the leave button in the top right corner. That's all I have.
Thanks, Brian. That's a good notice to all of us. Eric Hartstein, anything to cover? Okay. And we will give you all a 15-minute break. We'll aim for about 2:15 and see how things are going. So let's see here. We have Matthew, are you joining to listen in, or do you have public comments? I guess, Meg, if you could maybe check that with Matthew. I think probably Ken has public comment.
Sounds good.
And I guess, Eric Hartstein, I should turn over the public comment portion to you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. So we did not receive any written public comment in advance of this RAC meeting, but this is an opportunity now for verbal public comments. So we see Ken and Matthew are here. So do either or both of you want to provide any comments? And if you do, if you could please raise your team's hand. Okay, I see Ken's hand up. So Matthew, if you do, please raise your hands at some point between now and the end of public comment. But before then, we'll turn it over to Ken. Go ahead.
I really have very little to add. I think I put all of most of my comments in writing previously. I just want to remind that I do believe that groundwater should be a consideration and is an appropriate consideration, particularly if it can be directly tied to the protection of groundwater dependent ecosystems. Other than that, I'm willing to listen to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ken. Okay, so we can wrap up at least this first section of public comment now. We'll note that there may be an opportunity towards the end of this meeting, if time allows, for a second public comment period if attendees wish to have that. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Thanks, Eric Hartstein. So before we dive in to the final sections of the rule set, starting with 0205, to cover those before we come back to the top and do a walkthrough, any overarching questions or comments from RAC members? Okay, hearing none. You folks are quite aware of the fact that it's Friday afternoon. So I think, Brian, with that, I'll turn it over to you. And then Robin, if you can maybe start screen sharing, starting at 0205, that would be great.
Well, everybody, just to catch you up to speed on where we are, where we left off from a month ago, we got right up to the public involvement section, and that's where we'll start today. And in that section, we have a little bit of modifications that have been done. One was removing a reference to public hearings, and then also clarifying the written comment opportunity when the OWEB board meets to review and potentially award funds for a water acquisition proposal, that there's the opportunity for written comments and oral comments. And Renee, is there anything else you wanted to add for that section?
I think the only quick add that I would make, Brian, is this 0205 section does connect up a bit to 0202. We had talked about there was kind of an awkward remnant remaining in the rule set around community benefit and impact, and we talked some about that. So we're removing that because it doesn't connect up to an evaluation criterion, and we want to really underscore for folks that OWEB does have an extensive public notification process, and the board absolutely takes into account both written and verbal comment that they receive. So just wanted to make that connection between the prior section. And then the removal of the public hearing is simply because we are referencing a statute, a separate statute that has absolutely nothing to do with water acquisition projects. It was inserted at some point in the past, and it's relevant to conservation easements. It's not relevant to water acquisition projects. So we wanted to make sure that we are not retaining an incorrect statutory reference and process. So any questions on the public notification section or comments? And feel free to raise your Zoom hand, or you can just jump in.
Not seeing it. Or April, go ahead.
Yeah, just to ask a question. I think I know the answer, but feeling I need to do my duty as a rack number. So, Renee, you mentioned that ORS 271.735 is indeed an incorrect and irrelevant statutory authority. And I think the addition that you guys have made, where basically any written comments received by OWEB prior to the board meeting where they make a decision would be considered as part of this process, which I think is great. But in looking at the previous one, it references comments made at public hearings. And so I was just wondering, is that something that you guys have traditionally done as part of the water acquisition grants program, where there is a public hearing or some sort of public venue before the board meeting that this change would be altering, or is it something that you guys have never done?
So the public hearing reference was inserted because of the language in that ORS 271 statute that is a specific requirement for state agencies that will hold easements. So for example, on our land acquisitions where we hold a conservation easement on a fee title purchased by a grantee, we do hold a public hearing. We're required to. That's not relevant here. I would say that we've not held a hearing per se, but we do have, in addition to the full board, we have board committees that do meet and get previews of grant award recommendations that will be coming to the full board. So for example, in 2 weeks, I think it is, we have our acquisitions and restoration committee meeting. So that provides, it's not a public hearing officially, but it's a public meeting at which folks can also provide comments in addition to the board meeting, the decisional board meeting comment. So not a hearing. I just want to make clear it's not a hearing, but it is a public meeting. Does that help, April?
Yes, it does. And I think that matches, which is, for those of you that have had to either go through as a participant or an agency, those public meetings are usually not very well, public hearings, I should say, are not very well attended. But I think having a public meeting and having this additional ability to do written comment would meet, I think, the needs around making sure that people are aware and have an opportunity to comment before a decision is made. So I think that makes sense and appreciate the explanation.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for asking the question, April. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Right, well, great. Well, we can move on to the next section, board approval and delegation of authority. And here there were no changes proposed. Any questions on that section? Not seeing any. Then we move on to the next section, director's funding approval and distribution of funds. And here we just did a little bit of reordering to capture the sequence of events that occurs when a grant agreement is executed. Funding conditions are created by the board and the director. And then there's the legal terms, and then any funding is based on that. So that's just a little reordering, same information as what had been in the previous rules. And then if you look down at number 3, there is a little bit of word substitution there, using the word eligible instead of due diligence activities. So any questions on that section? Not hearing or seeing any. We can go on to the next section, and that's compliance and enforcement. And here, just a slight change to the director using their discretion to initiate any and all legal remedies available to OWEB. So just a minor change there. And then any questions on that? Not seeing any, and a lot of this at the end is pretty boilerplate language for all the grant programs that OWEB administers. And then there's a section on subsequent conveyances, and just ensuring that once a water interest is acquired by OWEB, it's not, shall not be conveyed to another party. Just some standard language. And then there's a waiver and periodic review of rules. No changes on that section as well. And we are actually going through that periodic review of rules process now. But that carries us through to the end. Is any questions on any of those sections as I move quickly through them?
And folks, I do want to put one pin in a topic that came up at our first meeting. I think maybe both April and Shyla, maybe it was Jess and Shyla, flagged, is there anything that we need to discuss related to monitoring expectations or requirements? I would say in terms of the rule set, we have tried to be fairly focused in terms of referencing monitoring, in particular, like that is one of the eligible uses of funds, but have not prescribed what monitoring will look like given the diversity of different instrument types that are possible to come into this program. So just wanted to say that from our perspective, the elevation makes sense in terms of any monitoring reference that we have in rule, knowing that there is space for example, a technical review team to suggest a certain type of monitoring, and for a grant condition to be added related to that, but not prescribing that in rule, since that can be quite extensive and a little bit tricky to figure out every scenario. But I just wanted to make sure that was the one issue as I checked back to our initial list of topics. We haven't really touched on it directly, so just wanted to flag that and see if anyone had any comments, questions, feedback on monitoring. Getting a thumbs up. Okay. April, go ahead.
This is part of my effort to be contributing on a Friday afternoon before my brain goes away. So that all makes sense, and I think this will be echoing previous comments that I've made, that once the rulemaking is all done, it would be helpful for OWEB to update some of the documents that are online. And I think in this regard, maybe having something that talks about post-award activities, or maybe you just say monitoring or anything along those lines, that I think would be helpful guidance. That makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Any other comments on monitoring? Okay, so Brian, I think we can, and Robin, I think we can go back to the top. We're ahead of schedule, folks. So I think we will take it from the top and see how folks are feeling about the one, if not multiple rounds of revisions we've done on some of these sections.
Yeah. All right. Well, now we're back to the purpose statement at the beginning of the rules document, and this will be a review. And I see Kaylin's hand up. Go ahead, Kaylin.
Feel free to walk us through, but there's been a change since the last version, and so I think we need to discuss the deletion of "or contractually protected in-stream flow" because it has ripple effects throughout the rules.
No, that's a good point, and that's where one of the RAC members, and maybe it was you, Kaylin, had wondered about legally and contractually being a duplicative statement.
It's fine if we completely strike contractually protected, but because contractually protected remains in the rules, the incomplete striking causes a situation where if a water interest is acquired via a water use agreement, there's now a question that's been created of whether that qualifies as legally protected in-stream flow. So either it's got to be all gone in the rules, or we need to leave it in there, but we can't go halfway.
Okay, and I think I did a search for all the other mentions of contractually and took those out and replaced them with legally. But if you found one of those that I missed, then it'd be great if you could point that out. And as we work our way down through the document, we'll get to that as we go through definitions and criteria.
I'll take a run through. I think I found a couple spots where it's still in there.
Oh, okay. And I see April's hand up.
Yeah, so I agree with Kaylin. I think the deletion of contractually is problematic, and she is correct. It's still listed in the definition section. And I think it is one of those things where technically it could all be legally protected. So, it's a bit of vernacular, but I think being consistent is important. And because at least I think in the traditional way, either it's legally, meaning through a filed transaction with the Water Resources Department, or it's contractually protected through a water user agreement or something else along those lines. But I think, either leaving it in or taking it out completely, as Kaylin suggested, is going to be helpful to avoid confusion about what that means or doesn't mean.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that. Yeah, and Kaylin, if you find others besides what April mentioned, let us know. Oh, I did actually have a quick check-in with Department of Justice, and our contact counsel agreed that legally does cover, whether it's through an administrative process with Water Resources Department as an example, or some other legal instrument in the form of contract. But point taken that if we're doing this, we need to go all in and be consistent. So just definitely flag if you see anything other than the definition where that is.
I'm just gonna highlight, I like it when DOJ agrees with something I say occasionally. So
well, happy Friday to you, April, then.
Okay.
Kaylin, were you going to add something?
No, just that my PDF reader is having a hard time distinguishing finding terms right now. So I'm trying to go through it with my eyeballs, which are tired. So I'll do my best.
Okay, thanks.
Spencer?
I'm just worried about the implications on the grant application and how will applicants differentiate between a OWRD protected amount of water versus a contractually protected amount of water? Is there going to be space in the application to differentiate between the two? Because they are all legally protected, I've learned, but distinctly different.
That's a good point. We will, as needed, make any modifications to the application to match the rule set once it's finalized.
And Spencer, are there certain, I guess, do you think there are certain pieces of information or categories of information that we would and should ask about differently? And if so, can you just go ahead and flag that now? Because we will be thinking about, we're already thinking about, like, how does this perpetuate through guidance such as what April mentioned, you referencing the application?
Yeah, I guess just big picture, I think there are different circumstances that kind of dictate whether or not a OWRD protected versus a contractually protected amount of water is appropriate. Maybe Jess can chime in here, or Corey or anybody. In systems where there are a lot of other users and active regulation by the water master, that seems inappropriate to rely solely on the contractual agreement. That's where it's much more appropriate to protect that water through OWRD. And then conversely, in situations where you have very few users on, say, one water body, the example I always give is one large ranch. In terms of ensuring that water stays in stream, there's not as much of a requirement to do that through WRD. Just a straight contractual agreement with a single landowner can be sufficient, in my opinion.
Thanks for that. Halen, go ahead.
Agree. First off, I'll agree with Spencer's take on that. But circling back, I found another contractually protected in-stream flow in the definitions, new sub 11 under water use agreement. So we could adjust that to legally protected in-stream flow. But that's just off the top of my head. I haven't really thought that through.
Thanks for that, Kaylin. I think one thing that we'll want to, if we are going the route of removal, I think one thing that we'll want and need to do probably is to make sure in definitions, we were working so hard, you all were really thoughtful about how do we ensure there's space for things like the alternate pathway and the Deschutes or the situation in the Walla Walla. So I think if any of those terms would inadvertently preclude a situation, I think we'll just want to be mindful of that, because I don't think that OWEB feels that strongly about leaving in legally or contractually. We were trying to just clean things up, but if we end up creating inadvertent problems, we can retain the old language. Yeah, April, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Renee. I think just in also trying to do a quick skim, the definitions that are in there currently wouldn't match with the deletion of contractually, meaning if you were to just go back to the legally protected in-stream flow definition and take out the contractually one, then it would only include WRD transactions. And I think just based on the conversations we've just had, that unless there's a specific reason for us to change that, leaving it as it was before and retaining the existing definitions would seem to be the best in ensuring that folks know that there's both of those options for putting water in stream through this program.
Thanks, April. Kaylin?
I'll go ahead and me too, what April said. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, Brian, back to you.
Okay, well, thanks for that great conversation. But getting back to the purpose statement, the rest was just some grammatical changes. and then also deletion at the end of that purpose paragraph for something that we no longer need to have in there. And any other questions on the purpose statement? Seeing none, we can move on down to definitions. And the first change that we come across is realigning the conserve water project definition to better align with what Water Resources Department uses. And just a definition for conserve water versus conserve water project is the only change there. And also the Oregon revised statutes being referenced.
And Corey, just a quick note for you. We recognize that by incorporating reference of another agency statute, that can create a little bit more work and coordination, and we think that it's worth it. So just a note there. We'll want to stay well coordinated with WRD.
And then moving on down through definitions, there were several places where there was a reference to an Oregon revised statute that is implemented by Oregon Water Resources Department, but not necessarily authorized by Oregon Water Resources Department. Those are legislative actions. So we took out that OWRD under the statute. So that's where you'll see those removed. And then as we move down, the technical review team reference is something that's covered in our overarching rules for all the OWEB grant programs. So we remove that. And let's see, there's just the addition of, there's the contractual or contractually protected. And from what I've heard, it sounds like it would make sense to just leave legally or contractually, or leave any version of the word contractual in the rule set, is what I'm hearing from the RAC team at the moment. And then as we move on down there, you'll see the water use subject to transfer definition, and that's the definition that what Oregon Water Resources Department uses, and that's what we'll use as a way to clarify when we're talking about a water right, water certificate, water claim would fall under that water use subject to transfer definition. Steve?
Definition 6 there, then if we scrap contractually protected, definition 6 needs to reference water use agreements, right?
Okay, so we would replace legally and go back to contractually?
No, I'm saying if we get rid of that word contractually, then this definition 6 needs to be broadened out to include water use agreements, because currently it only includes OWRD mechanisms.
Oh, I see what you mean. And I believe what we've decided is we're going to leave the term contractually where it had been in the rules that we've been operating under over the last 5 years.
Okay.
So definition 6 could remain as is.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
going to leave the comment in regardless, just so we have record of it.
Okay. Thanks, Robin. So any other questions in the definition section? Kaylin?
Thanks, Brian. If we add in water use subject to transfer, then we need to go back through all of the rules, and anywhere where it references a water right, we need to change that to a water use subject to transfer. Otherwise, we've got inconsistencies between water right and water use subject to transfer, and that seems like a problem. It seems to create an expectation that those are different things, and we know that they're not.
Okay, and as you mentioned that, I'm seeing several examples of, yeah, the term water right showing up where we would need to change that, including the awkward water use subject to transfer holder when referring to a water right holder.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at case law, it's a holder of a water use subject to transfer, but it's
Okay, great.
it is granted. Very awkward.
Okay, but yeah, that's a good to know that term. Any other comments on the definition section? Eric?
Yeah, thanks. I just noticed that in 6, the legally protected in-stream flow, it references conserved water projects, all capitalized. And we've said up above in the new too that it's conserved water, capitalized, and then project. So we should probably do some wordsmithing around that.
Thanks, Eric.
Okay, anything else on definitions? Okay. And thanks everyone for helping to make sure we get this exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so moving down to the next section is eligibility.
Do you want me to take this, Brian, a little bit of the orientation
Sure.
on groundwater? Yep. So thank you for initially flagging the groundwater topic and for what I think was a really valuable discussion during the last meeting. We definitely heard a diversity of opinions. I don't know that anyone, I'm certain actually, no one thought that there is an ultimate value. The takeaway we had from that is the maybe the timing and the pace is the bigger question around certainty for creating space. So definitely had some discussions internally about how might we test drive this without going so far as to initially incorporating it into rule, given some of the cautions, and I think well-informed cautions that we heard during the last RAC meeting. And I think I recall, maybe it was Kaylin saying towards the end, I think there might be space right now to do this for the right project that has that tie back to the constitutional intent. So what we are proposing, I would say, is a bit of a hybrid of not necessarily incorporating out of the gates during this rulemaking, very explicit and detailed space for, or not space for, confirmation of exactly how these projects would work, but making sure that in the guidance that's paired with these rules, we do outline some opportunities by which groundwater could come in to the program and line those out in guidance so that we can provide some clarity around expectations for applicants coming in and give us some space to test this, to see how would this work. What are the considerations that we think we should be making? What might we learn from some testing of it? And then based on that information, I think, and hopefully some lessons learned from that, have some opportunity to revisit how would we do this if formally adopting in rule groundwater explicitly. So I don't view this, and in talking with our director about this multiple times, I think this is not a situation where the agency is saying there's no space for this at all, I think, but trying to be a little bit measured about how we would create the opportunity to test drive in a much more explicit way, space for groundwater projects. So I think actually Brian outlined, and note folks, this is in draft form currently, but outline what might some of that content and guidance look like. So I think if we could maybe share that via screen share for folks to see, to get grounded in, and then maybe we can either talk through specifics of that, or if folks have just more global feedback on the proposed approach to groundwater, we can stop screen share so we can see one another better. But Brian, do you want to screen share the guidance?
Sure. So are you all able to see the proposed groundwater section for water acquisition program guidance?
We can. Can you zoom in a little bit, Brian? Or I guess folks can maybe use the Teams Zoom. That's great. Thank you.
Better?
Yep.
Yeah, so this starts out with a definition for groundwater dependent ecosystems, and then describes how groundwater rights are water rights, and depending on their location and hydrologic and geologic properties, the use of groundwater rights can affect surface water, impacting native fish, wildlife, and or water quality. And in Oregon, surface and groundwater systems are managed conjunctively when there is showing of hydraulic connectivity. And then you see the Oregon administrative rules that refer to that. And those state groundwater and surface water shall be managed conjunctively, where to do so will protect water resources, existing water rights, and the public interest. There are an increasing number of basins in Oregon with restricted groundwater use, meaning basins or reservoirs classified to limit new groundwater permits, or areas designated as critical groundwater management areas or other areas as determined by Oregon Water Resources Department is closed to further groundwater permitting. And the OWEB's Water Acquisition Grant Program will consider applications for groundwater projects that propose acquiring legal rights not subject to forfeiture that are in a restricted groundwater use area and can show a direct and demonstrable impact on a groundwater dependent ecosystem. Consistent with other applications, water acquisition grant applications that propose groundwater acquisition will be evaluated according to the criteria in Oregon Administrative Rule, and it references the criteria section that we just went over, 196, and in Oregon Administrative Rule 545, and that's that general OWEB grant program rule set. And to assist in this review, OWEB suggests that the applications clearly describe the groundwater dependent ecosystem affected by pumping from the subject groundwater right, the significance of the impact of the pumping on the designated groundwater dependent ecosystem, and the significance of the groundwater dependent ecosystem to Oregon's native fish and wildlife species and habitats, and the measures to monitor the effects of the acquisition on the designated groundwater dependent ecosystems to be protected. So that's the language that we've come up with for groundwater section that we're proposing to add to the water acquisition application guidance. And just wanted to put that out there for you all. And I see Kaylin has a question.
I was just going to express appreciation to you, Brian, and others who worked on this. I think this is a really solid place to, I'm still digesting the draft, but it reads as very logical and seems to create a lot of clarity around what the what would be an eligible water acquisition project for a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So like I said, I need to chew on it a bit more, but at first glance, I think this is a really good start.
Thanks for that input. Anton?
Yes, similar sentiments and echo Kaylin's compliments in putting this together. It looks like a terrific framework. To the extent that you're interested in feedback from the RAC, I'm sure some of us would love to dig into the details a little bit more. And one thing I did notice right at the beginning when you talk about Oregon conjunctively managing groundwater and surface water, while the OAR says that we're supposed to, in practice, it's a little bit more complicated. And Division 9 in particular gets into some of those details about how and when the state can manage conjunctively. So I think we need to flesh that out a little bit more. I wish we could just assume that that's how the state managed. It isn't in practice, actually. But again, like, this is nitpicking. This is a great first draft, and I hope you'll let us help refine it a little bit.
Okay, well, thanks, Anton. And the guidance document is typically updated between grant cycles, so there would be an opportunity to revisit and refine the guidance, including this groundwater section. But I appreciate your input on that. Thank you.
Eric Hartstein, any feedback on, I know that guidance has at times been used with other programs. I know you've talked about it with other RACs. In terms of how that works in practice, any guidance for us in getting feedback from folks? Because since it's guidance, it's not going to be within the formal Rules Advisory Committee structure, but just any suggestions you have on how to deploy those offers?
I think that's fantastic. Thank you for those offers. I think we can take you up on that if you have some time and space to work on the language here. Like, we've done that a little bit in the past with other guidance documents, and it's always helpful to have folks that kind of know the programs best to help develop the guidance. So yeah, thanks for now.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Steve?
Well, I like it for the most part. I would advocate that we be brave and put it in rule. I could foresee a situation where someone doesn't want a groundwater acquisition to happen and challenges a grant, and then you have to point back to the rule and what do you point to in rule that and you say, and then we can say, well, we have guidance. Well, why didn't you put it in the rule then? And I guess the only thing I question about the language here a little bit, and I know this is what Ken had in his testimony too, but I'm not quite sure why it would be restricted only to those certain groundwater restricted area, critical groundwater management areas. Because I could see where you might have a different situation somewhere else in the state where it made sense to do a groundwater acquisition, a well that was impacting an important spring. And so we're limited here to only certain areas of the state.
And the idea with those areas is there isn't new development of groundwater, and there's also restrictions and measurement occurring and monitoring and reporting. And so that was the idea of those basins.
Yeah, right, and that makes sense to some extent, but there's very specific situations out there where you might want to do one because the groundwater dependent ecosystem is being harmed, but those other conditions don't exist.
That's a good point, Steve. Thank you. Spencer?
Yeah, just to echo others, appreciate you all entertaining this. These ecosystems are definitely important and will be even more so in the future, probably. The two big sticking points for me are the quantification piece of how much groundwater and the pumping is connected to surface water. And that's going to be a really tough nut to crack. The other one is the protection of that surface water. And I think what's problematic here is that by limiting it to these restricted ground use areas, those inherently are places where there are a lot of other straws in the aquifer. And so presumably when anyone shuts off their well, there's going to be someone else there to suck up that water. I think the example we've used is maybe a single groundwater user adjacent to a really important spring. That scenario makes sense to me. There's a direct connection. You can quantify it potentially, and you can have assurances that the water is actually protected as surface water. If you're thinking about a basin where there are significant other wells, I find it unlikely that that water will actually surface. It'll probably be removed via other nearby pumps.
Those are good points, Spencer. Thank you. And, you know, and some of that could be resolved if this were written to say in a restricted groundwater use area and or in an area where you can show a direct and demonstrable impact on a groundwater dependent ecosystem.
So let me ask the group this, because I think some of what we heard during the third meeting was interest in having the tools around regulation, monitoring. I think just more kind of more well-developed quantification. And so I think that was part of our rationale for tightening down. And maybe some of this, I can't remember, Ken Beerley, I may not be giving you enough credit. Maybe some of that was in the language that you provided. So, but just, I think probably, I know that informed kind of our narrowing of proposed guidance. If there is more comfort or openness to that, then maybe at least what I took away from the last meeting in terms of other areas that aren't and those kind of critical designations, we're not opposed to it if it doesn't fly in the face of some of what we heard in meeting 3 around kind of the, I'm using infrastructure, but kind of the monitoring and tracking infrastructure to make this workable. So I'd just be interested in thoughts from folks who maybe expressed some of that during the last meeting, because it could be that we missed the mark in terms of geographies a bit. And maybe I should ask if my question makes sense. Does my question make sense or no? I think I'm trying to remember my notes from the last time. I think some of that concern was expressed maybe, Spencer, by you and maybe by Anton also.
Renee, you're talking about the areas where it would potentially be appropriate to go this route?
Yep.
Yeah, I think the example Steve gave and I gave of places adjacent to important springs and things like that that aren't necessarily groundwater restricted are sort of the obvious ones that I think like the technical review committee might be able to entertain. But in situations where there's significant groundwater appropriation, it's going to be really tough to ensure that the water that is not pumped is able to be saved and shows up in stream essentially as a surface water expression. Not suggesting those groundwater restricted areas don't need wells to be shut off and restored. I just don't know if we have the ability to ensure that water is protected. And so in my mind, it'd be great if there was a program like the surface water and stream leasing program for groundwater established by OWRD first.
Corey, don't worry, we won't hold your agency to that just because it was suggested in our rack. Okay.
Well,
Steve?
whether it's in rule or in guidance, I think if we get a chance to evaluate an application, a couple applications over the next few years, I think we'll learn a lot and about what's the right situation to do this sort of thing. And so I think it's good that we're open to trying it.
Great. Thanks, Steve. April, go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with the comments that have been made, and I think for the folks, a couple folks were also on WRD's massive water rights rulemaking that just concluded its public comment period, and in the context of the allocation of conserved water rules, this idea came up about groundwater, and Corey, I don't know if you know, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot for it, but I think Raquel had indicated in basically the groundwater did not make it into the proposed rules for this current rulemaking that the commission will be considering in March. But I think Raquel indicated that there would be some future conversations about the allocation of conserved water program. And I don't think it is slated for their next set of rulemaking, but it is something that, one, it will be a future conversation as part of that, but it's also something where it may be helpful, I think, both as individual RAC members that are on here that have an interest in pushing that issue to collectively express that to the department. But also that it is something that if at the end of this RAC process, if we, depending on where we land on this, have something that indicates that there was interest from the RAC in being able to include this, but it, would be helpful for WRD to have it more clearly clarified as it being eligible or how that would work and all those different things. And this is where my Friday brain is going to start to lose its efficacy, but hopefully a few of the folks that have been on the rack will be able to chime in and maybe make what I said make more sense. But again, I'm supportive of the notion of this being in there. I just think if we don't have clear direction or guidance from the department on how that works, then that doesn't necessarily seem like it is going to be helpful to include in this particular rack.
Yeah, thanks for that, April. And we are sensitive as a grantor to not be getting too far out in front of our subject matter expertise sister agencies. So thank you for just flagging that. Were there any other folks who were on that rack who want to share perspective? Yeah, Corey, go ahead. I know you weren't on your own rack. I know.
I wasn't on that rack, but I clearly agree with all the sentiment, the comments that have been brought up. Most recent thing that I was just informed of groundwater coming through ACW is that it's still being evaluated, but it hasn't been finalized yet. So I guess it's still under discussion whether groundwater would be allowed to go through ACW because, I agree with Spencer. How can you ensure it's protected? Because when somebody comes to the ACW program and they get their portion and the portion goes to the state, well, it stays in the source aquifer for the next user in line. So the state, to me, really isn't getting their piece. It's going to somebody else. So yeah, how can we guarantee the protection of that water within the groundwater ecosystem, and how much of it can be protected depending upon how many straws are in the ground?
Thanks, Corey. Anton.
I guess I was just going to sort of pile on with April, and that I think this is a good start. I thought this was kind of where we left it at our last RAC meeting, that this is a noble and worthy attempt, but we might be getting a little out ahead of the management tools that the state currently has. So, and that was definitely a takeaway from that mega rack with OWRD this spring when it came to groundwater stuff. So, just for what it's worth.
Okay, thanks, Anton. Jess?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question, and maybe this, as you brought up this topic, you already clarified, but I was under the impression after our last RAC meeting that all of us kind of agreed this was super important, but like Spencer and Corey have just said that we had a hard time figuring out how we actually implement this and guarantee the benefit that we need to see from it. So can you tell me where this came from to like draft the language and everything for this? Like I just feel like I'm missing something from the where we landed after the last meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I'll start and Brian definitely chime in. So I would say we heard mixed feedback. I think some folks were excited, and Steve mentioned it, I think, earlier in this meeting. I'd rather see it in the rules right now. And some folks definitely expressed some hesitation and concern about what are we there quite yet, and whether that is with some of the tools for protectability or for measurement. And so really our interest was hearing both of those kind of differences of opinion and offering up an opportunity for some testing of that, not incorporating into rule at the outset, because that does in some ways suggest we have this maybe more figured out than what it is. And hearing some of the descriptions from the WRD process, I think that underscores it, but providing some space for under certain conditions, someone could bring in a project that would have the ability to be vetted and reviewed against the evaluation criteria to provide some of that testing space for how this would work to inform rulemaking that could happen in the future. So it was really trying to find some opportunity to hear both of those pieces without jumping right to rulemaking that officially adopts this, provide some of that testing space. But Brian, thoughts to add from our follow-up conversations?
I think you covered it, Renee. Thank you.
And if we missed the mark, definitely let us know because I think I'm hearing a mix of, yes, this is great, would like to see it in rule, like to have some space and guidance, and maybe still some concern from this group. And we definitely need your input and help on this one. So Jess, any follow-ups, and then we'll go to Anton.
Just a quick clarification. So you could put this in the guidance for the program, but not refer to anything specifically in rule in this rulemaking. And this would allow for groundwater projects to come through and potentially be evaluated under our current criteria, even though we haven't in rule put any specific criteria for groundwater.
Yeah, so based on the research we did, anything that came in the door would have to have the ability to meet all of we'll get down to the evaluation criteria because you all have adjusted some things, including adding protectability into that. They would be evaluated against the evaluation criteria in rule without specifically calling out, okay, for groundwater projects, it's against maybe some other considerations. So the bar is the bar, regardless of if you're coming in with a surface water or groundwater project.
Okay, thank you.
Anton?
I mean, the policy nerd in me really wants to try to dig in with the guidance and see if we can make it work. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Division 9 gets into some of the situations where you actually do see OWRD conjunctively managing groundwater and surface water in practice, despite the sort of that laudable statement here from 694.10. So it would be interesting to take a closer look at that. But even in those situations under Division 9 where there is hydraulic connection established, we don't have the tools to protect that water in the stream itself, even if we've established legally there's that hydraulic connection. So yeah, I guess I would just again urge caution. I think we unfortunately kind of concluded before that this is great, but we might just be getting ahead of ourselves. So I guess just mention as much again.
Anton, April?
Yeah, so I agree with Anton, and also, yes, that that little policy nerd inside of me, which may be a big nerd, really also wants to try and make this work. But I think just because some of us have been part of some of those conversations and others haven't, from my perspective, this is more about the better overall, what's good for everybody, good water policy. And I think this is not a question of can groundwater be protected and can the Water Resources Department see that. It's more of the how, and I think especially through this lens where someone is getting public money, being sensitive to making sure that there can be a clear benefit that comes from those projects. And I just feel like there's been a lot of questions that have been raised fairly recently, both in this WRD rulemaking as well as some of the things that have come up in the legislative arena during the short session and this is not Corey's fault, but the department seems to be struggling with a few things related to how do we deal with critical groundwater areas and different mechanisms that may be used to either reduce what people are pumping or do different things. And I think it's a much larger topic than what we're going to be able to tackle here. But I also want to say for the record, since all these things are recorded, it is something that we should find a way to both clarify how that works in the different mechanisms that are legally available, as well as encourage folks to do that when we are looking at a very over appropriated, water limited system. But I think it is challenging that if there's not a clear process or pathway for that to occur, then it seems like it's just going to raise more issues than being silent on it.
Thanks, April. Kaylin?
A lot of good conversation on this, and I appreciate everyone's continued interest and thinking on it. I think that I'll just say again, I think the way that OWEB has proposed this guidance and not taken a run at the rules at this time is an elegant fix and does not tie an applicant's or even OWEB's hands to having water end up being protected via Water Resources Department. I think, again, one of the neat parts of OWEB's water acquisitions program is that it recognizes that water benefits can be realized through contractual means as well. So I just want to make sure that we're continuing to think creatively and broadly about this issue. And as I said at the beginning, need to chew on the good thinking that has kind of been put out here for us, and appreciate the opportunity to do so because, as Renee mentioned, it's not given that we would have a chance to think about this. Thanks.
Thanks, Kaylin. I think my question to the group is, would it be helpful for us to continue to walk through the rule set and really think about the edits to the evaluation criteria section and then kind of crosswalk back? Because what I want to, and Eric Hartstein, please jump in from your many rulemakings. What I don't want to do is have us spending a lot of time wordsmithing something that was not intended to be in guidance, but I think figure out the sense of the group around the assurance that you have from the evaluation criteria, and then determining, okay, relative to that, coming back to this document, are there pieces that are still uncomfortable that we should consider, even if we were incorporating that into guidance? But Eric Hartstein, do you have any suggestions in terms of RAC process when it's this kind of mix of proposing to address something, test driving it in guidance rather than in rule at the outset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to kind of go back to the rule here for the rules if we're ready, and then as time allows towards the end, after walking through the evaluation criteria and the other rules. I suspect we also might have another public comment period towards the end as well. So I think what you outlined is good, Renee.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Okay, so thank you for that, again, really productive discussion. Brian, let's go back to eligibility, and then we'll make our way down to evaluation criteria. And thanks, Robin, for screen sharing.
Okay, as we work our way down through the eligibility section, there was the just some that proposed idea of taking contractually out, but I think from what we've heard, we're going to stick with legally or contractually throughout the document. And then there's just some grammatical changes that were needed in this section. In that first in sub 1 and sub 2, but then you'll see in 3 a new addition of eligible activities, and this is where we start to get into programmatic work necessary to develop water acquisition projects. And so I wanted to take some time for you all to read that, since that's a new section in there. Steve?
While they read number 3, I had a comment about number 2. I think if you read number 2 literally, it really restricts the sort of projects that could be funded to only those where notice has been made to an irrigation district, where the project is within the boundaries of an irrigation district. I think what it really means is where the proposed water acquisition is within the boundary of an irrigation district, comma, the board will only consider projects that include written notice to that irrigation district.
That's a good edit. I think that is more clear.
I like it when somebody else points out those things that I don't have to.
So any comments, questions about the space being created for some programmatic funding requests that still are intended to align with the constitutionally dedicated lottery funds? April, go ahead.
So because we started to go down this path, I first want to respond to the note that Robin has put in there, and I know this may not be a specific nuance for her, but that it's specifically, as you guys have it currently worded into, that it's for projects that are within the boundaries of irrigation districts. It may or may not involve an irrigation district, but that notice for anything within a district boundary is really, really important for our people. So then on number 3, which is new, as you put, I do recall us talking about this early in our RAC process, and I think the first part of it, as far as clarifying that project planning, development, project design, and outreach with water right holders that directly relate to the proposed water acquisition project, that seems very straightforward and matches what I recall from those previous conversations. The part that I had a question about, and I apologize if this is something that was talked about in one of the meetings that I missed part of, but the second part of will lead to future eligible water acquisition projects in the same basin or other defined area as the proposed water acquisition project. One, it almost seems like that might be better as 2 separate statements. And then my second thought is how is that defined? I mean, is in the same basin, presumably as a watershed basin, but the other defined area, what does that mean? And if it would seem like that part is like that could be a future application, not something that is before the board at this time. So would it be where someone is asking for funds to do outreach in an area where there isn't an actual project yet? Would that be something that would qualify, or was that the intent behind this wording change? So those are just some of my thoughts and questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, April. And so the language in terms of the same basin or other defined area, depending on the scale. So for example, if we say the Rogue Basin, that might be perfectly acceptable if an applicant is thinking about how they build a water acquisition program that is basin wide. It could be that they're thinking about a smaller scale than that. So I think if I now know that a couple of you are attorneys, you might say it would still encompass that smaller area. So basin is a fine scale to work with, but it was basically not trying to assume that an applicant is working at a very large basin scale as large as the entire Deschutes, the scale as large as, the entire Willamette, having some sense of or ability for a defined geography that is tighter, in which a water acquisition project occurs. And in terms of the will lead to future projects, that is something that we've built into, for example, our engagement grant rule language, our technical assistant group rule language, because basically what we need to be able to support these other types of activities is a direct line to, it can't just be for that particular effort. It needs to have the ability to connect up to a restoration or a water acquisition or a land acquisition project. Ultimately, it needs to be able to have the potential to perpetuate those, because that is the direction to the agency within the Constitution. So, but for the potential to enable projects later, we wouldn't be funding an engagement grant or planning activities. So hopefully that helps to clarify a little bit of that will lead to future. Yeah, but let me know, April, if we're not wed to that geography language.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, that makes sense. And I think, just to be clear, I am supportive of that, because I do think, there's a lot of skepticism around a variety of restoration projects, and the best way to address that is by other landowners seeing the success of other projects. But the only thing I would suggest in the wording based on what you said would be to maybe just further clarify based on what you said that it's an other similar geographically defined area, or something that clarifies that it is indeed within a basin or some geographic, not statewide, not in another part of the state, or something along those lines.
Yep, perfect. Thank you for that. Kaylin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to build off of that, what April shared. I think the other defined area is really vague, and to me doesn't ring as part of a basin. But if you used, or portion thereof, you'd probably cover it.
Right. Thank you. Any other feedback on programmatic or any other aspects of eligibility before? Thank you, Eric Hartstein, for the reminder about break. We do need to take a break, but any other feedback on eligibility? Okay, seeing none. And our hope really with that space for some of the programmatic costs being eligible is that we'll get at some of what we have heard from this RAC and well prior to it around some of the constraints for those resources that are really critical to lay the foundation to have developed water acquisition projects come into this and other programs. Okay, so how about if we break until 2:35? Does that work for folks? Okay, 12 minutes. Okay, we'll see you back here at 2:35. Thanks, folks. Hi, Kate. We're actually on break right now until 2:35.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Sorry to be late.
No, it's okay. Thank you for joining. Do what you're able to, and you can always listen to the recording after.
Thanks. Bye. I mean, not bye, but bye for now.
Yep. Okay. All right, folks, it's 2:35. You could Either turn on your camera or give us a thumbs up so we know when we have critical mass. All right, while folks are coming back, Kate has joined us. Kate, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kate Fitzpatrick, Executive Director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. Apologies for missing the first. I'm a little under the weather, so I'm going to try to follow along this afternoon. Thanks for hosting.
Yep. Thanks for being here, Kate. Yep. So we walked through the final sections of the rule set that we had not yet gotten to, and we just made it through eligibility. We'll be circling back on groundwater after we get through the remaining revisions. So I think, Brian, do you want to kick us off at use of grant funds?
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, we're in section 0185, use of grant funds. And the first addition you'll see there in sub 2 is the cost of water conveyance or water use efficiency project elements with some details about that. And that is to capture those allocation of conserved water projects or just when we're working on irrigation efficiency projects that result in protected water in stream.
Helen?
Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Brian. A couple things here. We need to fiddle with the language a little bit because it's we're referencing legally protected in-stream water rights, but that's not a term that we use in the defined terms. So I'm not sure exactly what we're going for there. And then I wanted to dig in a little bit more on the or other department administered in-stream flow water conservation program. It's not, I'm just not clear on what that's getting at. So if we could shed a little bit more light, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure. What we're talking about here are efficiency projects that result in legally protected in-stream water, such as an in-stream water transfer that would occur with an allocation of conserved water project. But we also have that second phrase or other department administered in-stream flow water conservation program. And that is to cover programs like the Deschutes Alternative Pathway, which is similar to the allocation of conserved water program, but different because of the timing issue where the water's not left in stream during the typical time of use in the Deschutes example. And over the next 5 years after these rules are adopted, there could be additional water resource department in-stream water conservation programs that are developed. And so it's just to capture that possibility as well, instead of calling out just the Deschutes example.
Thanks, Brian. It gets a bit, others might not be confused by it, but because we've also got this definition for conserved water, it looks like the intent is to make this different than the definition for conserved water, but also still get at other programs that intend to conserve water. So again, I missed this in my first run through, and so I apologize that I haven't quite digested it, but I understand the intent, and I'm just I'm wrestling with whether the language that's there accomplishes it.
We basically want to show that it's an acceptable use of grant funds to pay for that irrigation efficiency infrastructure, whether it's piping a canal or on-farm efficiency, as long as it's resulting in legally protected water in stream.
So given that we have made well, we've found some additional work that we need to do on the definitions, which we appreciate the flags on that earlier. I do think, one, cross-checking that back to some of these, the revisions that we highlighted for the definitions is important. And I think to your point, Kaylin, Corey, it could be that maybe we want to work again with you on language that's, I guess, maybe less fuzzy, because this does, I think there's a little bit of inside baseball happening right now. And if it wasn't clear to you, Kaylin, exactly what that was pointing to, we might need to find a way to be a little bit more specific. Yeah, any other suggestions on this? Otherwise, we can take it offline and continue to work through that. April.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, and as you've noted, and as we've discussed, there'll be some additional work around the definitions, but if we're going with the leaving existing definitions, and either that's going to say, well, as we talked about, legally protected in-stream water right can mean both through the department as well as through water use agreements. Do we need to fully state out other department administered in-stream flow water conservation programs for that to be an acceptable use, or not? And I think maybe this is more of a question for the department, and I don't know, Corey, if you feel comfortable answering that or not. I do think that it's good, like in the groundwater discussion, if we can find a way to leave space for things that aren't fully defined to allow for that. But then conversely, if we don't need to add extra language that may be confusing to people, then maybe we don't need to spell that out for this instance.
Thanks, April. Corey, any thoughts? And not to put you on the spot, if you don't want to respond here, that's perfectly acceptable.
No, I completely agree. I mean, especially since we don't really have a definition or anything in rule regarding the Deschutes alternative pathway specifically. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'd have to agree with you that we might have to work on some of the language to make it less fuzzy.
And Kate, I know you're not feeling great, but if you have anything to chime in on with this, please do.
Yeah, I feel like we've been wrestling with this a little bit. I think one of the things that's different than the definition is the eligibility to pay for infrastructure components was directly linked to the allocation of conserved water programs. So we were just wanting to make sure that those type of project activities got covered in a different conserved water pathway, which may not be explicit if you're just acknowledging that other water use agreements are possible. But that's just I don't have an answer. That's just a question maybe for OEB to think about. It was less the definition we were worried about and more making sure that the eligibility and funding elements related to conserved water also captured state protected conservation projects that went through a different pathway.
Great, thank you for that, folks. We'll circle back on that.
I'm
Brian,
just going to chime in really quick and make sure I captured that conversation right. So try to distill it, but particularly Kate, your last comment, just to make sure that this eligibility connection is what you wanted.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, moving on to the next section in sub 3, just added a few more words in there to further define the types of costs that are eligible. And then in sub 5, added water right review to a type of due diligence activity. And then in sub 7, it was determined we don't need to have the reference to the Oregon Constitution article there. And but this is talking about monitoring, and based on conversation we've had at earlier RAC meetings, that the monitoring be consistent with the intent of the grant application and allowing for any conditions listed in the grant agreement. And I know that monitoring can be challenging for the applicant or the grantee once project's happening. Just wanted to make sure, Jess, Kate, as implementers, wanted to make sure you're comfortable with that. Not hearing any comments. So then number 8, we added in other reasonable costs for project planning and outreach. And this is again getting at that programmatic work necessary to develop water acquisition projects.
And we'll carry forth the edits that we talked about in terms of the spatial footprint.
Oh, good point. Any comments on that use of grant fund section? Not seeing any. That brings us down to matching contributions. And here we're going to rely on the overarching OWEB rule set that mentions match will be described in the announcement for grant offerings. And but then we do, as you look down through the costs, we did take out one section there on just the what was in parentheses regarding funding commitments made by others. And you'll see in the comment, and this is where the topic of premiums, where sometimes with a water valuation for a basin, not only is there a range of values for water to be purchased for lease or permanent purchase, there's sometimes a premium put on that as an incentive for a water right holder to consider being part of the deal. And wanted to put that out there. Renee, I didn't know if you wanted to further define the conversation.
Yeah, so this came up as we think about both our land acquisition grant program and water acquisition. So for example, in our land acquisition grant program, we have guidance that describes that we do not pay above appraised value. That does not mean that an applicant coming in with a proposed land acquisition might not pay above appraised value, but they can't ask us for that kind of above and beyond funding. And per our current guidance with land acquisition, we don't allow that above and beyond to be eligible match. So just in thinking about this across programs, that kind of analogy that we had, that we identified was kind of the topic of premiums. I think it's a bit squishier because if I think about valuations, premiums can be considered within the range of potential value for a water right. So I just wanted to thought it would be helpful, since we have the set of folks convened for the RAC, if you have feedback on if it really passes the straight face test in terms of having premium be considered eligible match. I think the question for us, and same with the land acquisition, is we don't want to be inadvertently setting market rates. And so if the risk feels fairly low to folks and you feel like it's an important tool for folks to have in the toolbox and be able to claim as eligible match, then that's okay. But I didn't want to just raise it with this group because we do have sensitivity around not setting markets. So any feedback on that? Spencer?
Just a clarifying question. The 25% match is still required, correct?
So it will change. By pointing back to Division 5, we've now created an ability for the required match to be set when each grant cycle is open for an individual offering. So we could choose as an agency to have that be a lower number.
But likely above 0.
It must be at least 5% per Department of Justice in terms of our statutes and what was intended with match being a requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anton?
Just sort of comparing and contrasting with some of our federal funding sources. I don't know that we can pay above fair market value for land and water and any of those, even if we're bringing in match, because effectively, if we bring in match that boosted above fair market value, we're defeating the point of that prohibition in the first place, which is trying to avoid inflating the market. So I don't like premiums. You've probably heard my diatribes on this before. So I would definitely prefer to steer clear of them and match or anything. But that's just my experience. If others feel like they can be useful, I'd love to hear that, but I would definitely advocate trying to avoid them if we can.
Okay, thanks, Anton. Thoughts from others? I don't know, Kate, Jess, Shyla. Any on the ground feedback? Anton, recognizing you are also on the ground, but you're the one who made the comment.
Very much at the ground level. Yeah, that's true.
Not seeing any other comments on that topic that
I raised my hand
Steve?
there. I hate it when the insurance companies call what you pay them a premium. It sounds good. Like, it sounds like something really good. You get to pay your insurance premium. I guess I feel like if there's cost, what is the cost of the water? And then there's value. And I look at really from the value, what are we getting in value? And, not every acre foot that you buy is the same out there. Some have a lot more value than others. I think notwithstanding your OWEB's policy and whatnot, I think it's worth paying a premium, if we want to call it that, to get, the high value deals that have, multiple STE species and the in-stream benefits are over miles of stream, et cetera, versus a different deal that's the same cost, but there's one snail there and you're only helping them in a 100-acre reach of the stream or something. So I really feel strongly about that, but I don't know about the match part of this, but there's no water for sale, and everybody you're approaching out there, you have to pay them a premium to get their water away from them because they're making some other use of it. And the incentive is you're paying them a lot of money, usually if it's good water right. So I don't know and what I found is, you get an evaluation done by Westwater Research or something. The valuation comes in about half of what you need to pay to get it away from the water right holder, because they do it on an ag production basis or something. I found that their valuations are never enough, it seems like, to get the deal. You can't just approach the landowner or the water right holder with Washwater's valuation and say, here's our offer, and they jump on it. It seems to me it's a lot of times that you have to offer more than that, more than the fair, what the valuation experts say is the fair market value. Now of course, there's other circumstances where that doesn't hold true, but.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see, Anton and then April.
Oh, just going to respectfully disagree a little bit and point out the places that we have to offer more than Westwater valuations is where in the past Westwater included a premium in their valuation and we paid that amount. So I understand my sample size is just limited to my geography. It's taken about 10 to 15 years to get past the damage that premium had done over in Catherine Creek, but I think we finally got to the point where Westwater valuations are being accepted there again, and we haven't had an issue with them anywhere else, but we've been very disciplined about only paying that amount. And yeah, certainly the water has outsized ecological benefit or value in some places, but we're not playing in an ecological value market. We're playing in the economic market, so we just have to compete with the other economic uses. So I think fair market value makes a lot of sense. So just respectfully offer a counter perspective on that. Thank you.
April, go ahead.
So I agree with Anton wholeheartedly, and while I don't have the same specific experience that he does, I think this topic as a whole is just far too complicated. And my personal opinion is there's really no accurate way of valuing truly what this means to any given entity that may look at it from their perspective. And I think our existing methods, while they can always use improvement, there is at least some established basis for an economic valuation. And by that, I would just say that, the value of working lands, the value of how that water is used means lots of things to different people, community, and in all different places. And I think it's something that we should just stay away from this particular topic. I think it just has too many areas that could undermine, I think, otherwise what is a good program. And I think, the people that, let's just say, have more means, they're not the ones that necessarily need to be seeking these types of grants anyways. But it just seems like this is a thorny topic, and so I think we should not touch it.
Thanks, April. And to be clear, in terms of land acquisition, that kind of information is contained within guidance. So but wanted to raise the topic with the RAC, just given that there is a bit of an analogy. Spencer, go ahead.
Maybe I'll just state the obvious that I think the likelihood of folks going this route of valuing at a premium, so part of that can be used as match, is entirely dependent on that percentage rate of required match. And if it drops to 5%, this issue probably disappears.
Okay, yep. We'll take that under advisement. Okay. I think that covers it. Brian, we'll turn it back to you.
Right. Thanks. Great discussion. I think that gets us through the matching contributions. And the next section was the coordinating and partnering with other funders section that has been removed and summarized a little later on. We'll get to that. And then the next section, the evaluation criteria. And here there's a modification to sub 1A, just some rewording of that, and also took away some of the language defining flow targets and just left it as a state, federally, or tribally supported flow target. And then just some adjustments with monitoring, wherever the monitoring would be criteria looked at regarding monitoring looks at both project compliance and project outcomes. And then in sub 2, these were characteristics of a water right that were already in rules. And the only addition here is adding the word protectability. And this is some of what we were trying to get at with the groundwater discussion earlier, is if water is purchased or leased, is it protectable? And it's based on what's the management framework out there on that reach of stream, what's in place in the way of monitoring gauges, the ability of the state, or if it's a water use agreement, of the partners in that agreement and the applicant to ensure protectability. And wanted to put that, or wanted to see if people are comfortable with protectability being added to those characteristics of a water right.
I think that's great. Thank you.
I see a thumbs up, a couple more. Okay, seems like that's an okay addition. And then the next section down the addition for sub 2A. And this is where we're referencing if a project's utilizing the Water Resource Department's allocation of conserved water program or other department administered in-stream flow water conservation program. And again, that's where we're trying to get at the Deschutes alternative pathway. The priority date of the conserved in-stream water right shall be the same as the original right. And so that's based on our conversation from the last RAC meeting. And wanted to see if there's any comments on that addition. Not seeing any. And then moving further down, there's an addition in 3 sub C, and that's if the project is utilizing the Oregon Water Resource Department's allocation of conserved water program or other department administered in-stream flow water conservation program, the project cost relative to the amount of water and the amount of conserved water over the required percentage that will be protected in stream. And so this is an additional way to consider the alignment of the proposed cost of a water acquisition with the work necessary to complete it. How much water is coming out of a allocation of conserved water program project compared to the cost, and is the applicant and the water right holder, have they come up with a transaction that's above the required percentage that's based on public dollars going into the project? And it's just something that the technical review team could be considering as they're looking at a project. And I'm curious to see if there's any comments on that concept or how it's worded.
We'll take silence as comfortable with, agreement on.
Not seeing any comments or hands raised, not hearing any comments. And then down at the end in 4 sub 4C, there was just some redundancy with references to federal, state, or tribal plans. And that is already covered in the beginning of the criteria section, where it mentions state, federally, or tribally supported flow targets.
I'm not sure.
Oh, go ahead, Spencer.
I was just going to say, I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly, if state, federal, or tribally supported flow targets are equivalent to flow restoration plans and prioritization efforts.
Oops. Yeah, I was gonna have the same comment. I think those are different, and there's, you know, conversations around whether if this is supported in a broadly supported planning effort, does that merit extra consideration in the review process, which would be different than making sure the flows were set by an agency or tribal process.
So it sounds like there's some interest to keep that criteria in there, is what I'm hearing, that it's different enough than a flow target if it's something addressing habitat or water quality.
That would be my recommendation. You know, a flow target is reach or river specific, whereas a prioritization document could be for the entire state, for the entire basin. So I think they're different enough to warrant having both of them in there.
Okay.
And that was our catch on perceived redundancy. So we're perfectly comfortable adding that back in.
Right. Well, that's got us through the evaluation criteria pretty quickly. Any lingering thoughts or ideas on any of those changes?
Just circling back on the groundwater piece, if this is sort of the project evaluation metric portion of the rules, I think we need to have something in here about quantification of the connection between the water use and the stream that it is intending to benefit. I mean, that's an obvious connection with surface water rights, but not with groundwater.
Spencer, will you restate that? I did the same thing. Quantification of, and I got to the water use and.
The water right use and the surface water it's intending to benefit or connected to, right? You, in theory, you stop diverting 1 CFS out of a stream, that 1 CFS goes back in the stream. That's not the case for a well and a groundwater right necessarily. And so there needs to be a process to evaluate that.
Robin, you set? Yes. Phelan?
I wonder if that's, I don't disagree that we need to be looking at how we monitor. And I think that that was called out in, if I'm recalling the draft guidance. And I wonder if the protectability does start to get toward that as well in a different way. But again, don't disagree that we need to monitor to ensure that there's benefit.
I guess in my mind, there's just an additional analysis step when it comes to groundwater to make that connection between the groundwater use and the surface water that's intending to benefit. It's not through monitoring, and I'd argue it's not through protectability. It's an additional prior step to look at the groundwater surface water connection.
Anton, go ahead.
I wonder if this might be when we come back to my favorite division today, Division 9, and require that there's hydraulic connectivity established by the state between that groundwater source and whatever stream is trying to be benefited. Is that getting to what you're thinking, Spencer?
Yeah, definitely. And it needs to go beyond that, in my opinion. It needs to not just be that there's a connection, but you need to be able to quantify that, because that would go into how you value the water, right? If maybe it's only a 50% connection, then you wouldn't want to pay for 100% of the groundwater right. You'd only want to pay for that portion that will have a direct connection and impact on the surface water. And that's all a lot easier said than actually done.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question, I think, to folks is this will require, I mean, we would need to signal to applicants via guidance as an example, plus inclusion of maybe some other distinct language in rule. You need to have done a fairly significant amount of legwork. And I'm not suggesting that any applicant that comes in the door for a grant, whether it's water acquisition or other, shouldn't have done a fair amount of legwork. But this will need to be well articulated and an estimated quantification, to your point about valuation. So I'm not opposed to that. I guess my question, maybe back to this group, is how feasible is that for someone who's a project developer on a proposed groundwater project? Do we have a sense of that? Kaylin, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a groundwater expert, but based on conversations that I've had with people who are, it sounds like it's a case by case determination. And that's why these conversations have been so interesting and challenging, is that we are embarking on things that are a little harder than just stopping pulling water out of the stream. And so I don't at all mean to imply that I have any groundwater expertise, but I do get the sense that there would be, for any particular water acquisition project that was proposed, there would need to be a robust way to quantify that. And in some cases, as we've discussed here, that burden kind of won't be meetable. But I think that what we're trying to do is talk around, maintain space for the ones that where it is, but not be overly prescriptive in how we require that quantification to occur.
And I think that piece is important, because what we want to be clear on, even if it's not in rule, it is something that we would be describing more in guidance, but having the sufficient sideboards for in rule, is not to misrepresent the openness. If there are some pretty clear bars that folks need to be able to meet to bring such a project into this program. So I just, it's a transparency question. So any thoughts from others? I know, Brian, we still need to get through a few other sections, but since we've come back to the groundwater topic, thoughts from others about anything additional needed in the criteria related to groundwater, or if we think about potentially having some space for that in guidance. Okay. Seeing none. Brian, you want to walk us through the remaining sections?
Yeah, next section, 0200 application evaluation process. And here there's just some grammatical changes regarding the options of do fund, fund with conditions, or do not fund. And there wasn't a need to have that deference statement in there. And there was discussion at the last meeting about ranking, and we've retained the language around ranking the order of projects. And then there's a new sub 3 that's been added in. And this is that section of operational efficiencies between water acquisition project funders. And just to the extent practical, OWEB's application evaluation process will create operational efficiencies and complementary investments by coordinating with other agencies and funders that sponsor water acquisition grant programs. So that whole section's just been encapsulated in that one statement. Any thoughts on that section? Not seeing any. And then the next section, the staff funding recommendation process. And here there's just a reference to as conditions are placed on individual projects, just clarifying that those are suggested by the technical review team, and that's just mentioned in 2 different locations. And that could, and if it is an allocation of conserved water program, then that would be the place where there would be a condition regarding the same date. And then the next section is funding decision, 0202. And that is just clarifying on public comments received, that is considered by the board, that as they're considering recommendations from staff, that they're also thinking about any public comments received as written comments or during the board decision meeting. Any comments or questions on that section? Not seeing any. And then we're down to public involvement, and oh, that's where we were. That's where we started today.
Okay, congratulations, Rack. You've made it through the entire rule set. And we still have some work to do. So, Eric Hartstein, are you fine with us just circling back? I know the thinking was ask a question about if there's an additional public comment need. It looks like Ken saying yes. But Eric, before we move to that, I would like to take the temperature of the group on groundwater relative to the conversation we just had about evaluation criteria, and recognizing that multiple of you have offered to share your expertise and brains with us and thinking about some of the guidance. But just wanted to take the temperature. Are folks comfortable with incorporation of revisions into evaluation criteria, and then some more looking at and work on guidance that we could then share with you in what I expect will be a brief meeting 5? Because I think it's really important, frankly, to have some understanding of how this would play out in guidance if we're talking ultimately with the OWEB board about adopting rules that would create some testing space for groundwater. We want to have the opportunity to think through that if this is going to be considered. So, Spencer.
Just a question. I don't know if it's appropriate or not for RAC to take a vote, but that seems like one way of going about it.
Yeah, I think we normally don't. Eric Hertzstein, there you are. We don't normally have RAC's vote.
Informally.
Maybe, what's your thought, Hertzstein?
I'd rather we try to get to a consensus or close to it, if possible.
Okay. Steve?
Well, previously we had comments submitted by WaterWatch, who made the case from their perspective that groundwater was not an eligible acquisition under OWEB's authorities. And Mr. Ken Beerley made the case that it was. I feel it is, but I'm curious, actually, what does OWEB think and what does the RAC think about that? I think it'd be nice to have on the record the position of the RAC as to whether a groundwater acquisition is, within the realm of OWEB's authority.
I want to be careful, Steve, about not asking. I know we actually have some attorneys on this RAC, but not asking RAC members to provide legal interpretation for us. I think that, I guess, maybe can we reframe that though as what are the conditions? And I would go back to maybe some of what we heard about earlier in this meeting, like under what conditions would it appear that connection to native fish and wildlife species and their habitats is sufficiently well established? And we heard an example of spring.
Under certain conditions, under the right conditions, would people support it, whether that's in rule or in guidance?
So let's go to April, and then we'll see if folks have other conditions, under what conditions to share beyond what we heard earlier. April, go ahead.
So I think, Renee, you said taking our temperature. So this is just me kind of being responsive to that. I will admit I'm a little confused as far as where this specifically goes, in that we took out the changes that were proposed in the rules, but we talked about guidance, which is it that we're being asked for. But I think, based on my understanding of the conversations that were during the WRD rack, where there were some proposed changes to the allocation of conserved water program. Water Watch was also participating in that rack. The department, while they did not go through with making those specific changes to Division 18, they did indicate when they were responding to rack comments that they do feel that they have authority to process groundwater certificates under the ACW program. So again, it's not a question of if, it's how. And I think that's the challenge for OWEB, is that I do think we're going to find a way to figure out the how, but there needs to be more discussions about that. And so I think for me, I generally think, well, if you're putting something in guidance, that's just to help people understand how things are going to work. It's not the same as putting it in rule or statute, but there's a fuzziness here that I'm just not entirely comfortable with, in that OWEB is going down this path before WRD has actually figured out what that looks like. And as other people have indicated, groundwater, there's different types of projects that it could involve groundwater that have different aspects to them, where the monitoring would be very different. And how, again, it gets down to the how. And so I think that's a challenge. If you guys are saying, put something out that leads a person to believe, well, hey, I can do a project with this. And then it's like, well, we don't know how to monitor that. We don't know how to evaluate that. We don't know what the benefits are or not. And I do think that it is something, again, just to be clear, we need to find a way to incorporate these projects into various conservation programs and grants and all those things. But if we can't figure out the how, and the department isn't really clear on the how, and there's disagreement across different interests, then for me, that makes it something that seems like it's a little premature. But going back to the first part, I'm not, again, sure if we're talking about the rule changes or the guidance. So that's just my read on the temperature, which I guess would be lukewarm, tepid, definitely in that realm.
Yep. And for clarification purposes, what we are proposing is that additions like protectability or quantification, I'm not going to find that language that we just talked about, but the quantification piece of that connection from groundwater to surface water, that would be proposed in rule. What Brian shared would be in guidance. That would be kind of outlining, these are the things any potential applicant who's reading our guidance and contemplating a groundwater project would need to be prepared to answer questions about. But it would not be adopting that document that Brian shared into rule at this point.
So if I may ask a follow-up, how many folks are coming to OWEB wanting to do these types of projects and then being told no, or kind of like, what's, maybe from your guys' perspective, what's the need, the demand for us to clarify this now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, April, and Brian and Eric, please chime in. I don't know. Certainly for water acquisitions, the number has been zero, to my knowledge, Brian.
We have been contacted, but we didn't know if that contact was representing a multitude of potential applicants or whether they were just asking on behalf of one.
And we did, April, when you may recall, during second special session in 2021, there was an initial drought resilience package that had some targeted funding that OWEB administered and went to, say, Jefferson County, Klamath County. There was some statewide irrigation modernization funding, and there was space through that general fund program to do just a bit of this down in Klamath. Brian,
And also
yeah.
to clarify, we haven't had an application come in specifically for groundwater, but there have been some phone calls and inquiries over the last few years.
Shyla?
Yeah, just, thinking from Wasco SWCD perspective, we've had some groundwater issues that we've been working on for decades out in the Mosier area. And I know we had sent several applications to OWEB years ago asking for assistance with groundwater, and those were consistently turned down. And so we started looking for outside sources. And so we haven't even had OWEB kind of on our radar for groundwater issues for some time based on that. And so I think, just knowing the fact that we're continuing to work on those, I'm excited that this conversation is coming up just because it is such a huge statewide issue and such a need. So that being said, we've gotten funding through Water Resources Department through some of their programs, feasibility studies, and some of their water program grants to do some studies, to do some well remediation and repairs. And, we're seeing some positive trends in that Mosier area, but we're also seeing increasing declines in other areas and a lot of questions coming in from landowners. So I think, just from my perspective, I think it's an important conversation to have. And again, from just on the ground perspective, I think, it's something certainly we want to be very thoughtful about framing that up. And I appreciate the conversations around groundwater dependent systems and sort of really linking that with that surface water. But, just knowing, I think there's a huge need out there and potentially, opening up a pretty big universe for groundwater requests. So, that's kind of my 2 cents. I'm excited about it, but also think I agree, it's something we want to be, tread carefully and be very thoughtful as we craft this conversation.
Yep. Thanks, Shyla. Appreciate that. So Eric Hartstein, thoughts about the way to take a temperature on this, because I think we have a diversity of opinions.
Yeah.
Sure. I don't know that consensus is happening.
Right. Well, and I also want to make clear that, I think you stated that we're talking about rule versus guidance here. And I think what I'm mostly hearing is people are pretty comfortable with the rules. I mean, there's, I think, some revisions that we need to do that we've discussed today. But the kind of the contention is around the guidance piece. So, I think we probably would just need to determine, if the RAC is comfortable with the rules as is, and, we could think more about guidance, before the next meeting. And I also know we have public comment too. That's probably forthcoming.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And I also just want to assure all of you that we may not solve it in the RAC, because ultimately we will give an update to the OWEB board in April about status of the rulemaking process. They will review and consider adoption of rules at the July board meeting. And our board sometimes changes things that come out of a RAC process, and there needs to be kind of clear discussion and justification of that. And if it means delaying adoption, then the board has done that. And so I think just knowing that this is not the final word on this, because they will want to understand things like, how does this work relative to WRD programs? What is the public comment that they might receive with varying opinions about this topic? So given that, I do think it makes sense to have a 5th meeting, even if it is short. We do need to review rule revisions on this, and we can go back and do some additional thinking on the guidance piece to try to get a sense of, can you get to some consensus on that, or is it just not the right time? Because we can report that back to the board too. So any final comments on that before I ask Eric to take the baton for public comment number 2? Okay, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. All right, so second public comment period. I did see Ken raise his hand a little bit earlier, but also want to give other folks an opportunity, if you're interested in providing verbal public comment, to raise your team's hand. Okay, so Ken, if you're ready, you can provide your verbal comments.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
All right, I really appreciate it. Very good conversation, interesting conversation. But I would like to go back to the context, particularly about groundwater. One, what you're talking about is acquiring water rights. And groundwater rights are no different than surface water rights, except for you're pumping water out of the ground. You don't see it. So that's important. I think it's also important to provide the context that in 2024, the Water Resources Department significantly changed the permitting process for groundwater, showing that and creating a situation where many basins in the state will no longer be eligible for permits. Third, in 2025, the Water Resources Department adopted critical groundwater management area rules that and applied them for the first time in the Harney Basin. I think April's question about are you being inundated with applications for groundwater is appropriate. No, nobody thought about selling groundwater rights at any extensive amount, and it was never considered, partially because there's a whole industry built around surface water and water conservation by nonprofits that bring those projects to the board. So I think that's important context to understand. I think I really like the guidance approach. I think it is wise to try to create the narrow mechanism. And what I like about what I saw from the proposed guidance is that you defined a very narrow suite of areas that where additional groundwater development would be impossible. They're either critical groundwater management areas or classified areas where there is no further development available. And then you had to demonstrate that, one, there was a direct connection to groundwater dependent ecosystem, and two, you had to show that what that direction is. So the burden is on the applicant to demonstrate the benefit, to demonstrate the effect of that benefit. So I think that the guidance is a reasonable approach to try something new, and it will be new. But also, I don't think you're going to get a whole lot of applications because right now, because this surface water is so over allocated around the state, people are relying on groundwater to survive, particularly in the Klamath Basin, where you've got, and Water Resources Department went through a determination of connection between surface and groundwater and lost it at district court level. But they have, at least in their mind, demonstrated the connection between surface and groundwater, showing that gaining reaches of streams could, by reducing groundwater within a mile of that gaining reach of stream, they could provide additional flow in particularly the Sycan and Williamson, or Sprague and Williamson rivers. Anyway, I think the guidance approach is wise. I think it has the protections that would limit applications to places where that determination of whether there would be a benefit or not could be clearly determined given the basic rules that you have for acquisition of water rights. And I think it's also important to understand that not all expression of groundwater is going to be as surface water. There are groundwater dependent ecosystems that don't rely on surface expression of water. Phreatophyte growth is a groundwater dependent ecosystem that's dependent upon a certain water table level. And if you can assure that the water table won't decline below a certain level, you're protecting that ecosystem. So we have to think three-dimensionally instead of two-dimensionally. It's not just water runs down a stream and it either goes into a ditch or it goes downstream. It's more complex than that. And I think trying to create an opportunity for people to at least explore that, and the guidance is a way to do that that I think is reasonably elegant, and could provide some learning on whether or not anybody can demonstrate that there's a benefit. So I appreciate your consideration. I think it's worth wrestling with, and I think you've done a good job wrestling with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, other folks wanting to provide verbal comments at this time? Okay, not seeing any. Back to you, Renee.
So could I get a raise of hands for those folks who are interested in some follow-up discussion about the guidance content? Anton, Kaylin, Spencer, April, Corey, Shyla, okay. Jess, okay, so nearly the entire rack. So Shyla, Jess, Corey, Kaylin, Spencer, April, Anton, Kate also? Okay, all right. So Eric Hardstein will figure out how to do this in an appropriate way that meets public meeting requirements. We'll go back and huddle about that. Then we'll circle up with all of you to determine how iteration on this will be possible before a next meeting. I do think, Kaylin, is that question?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was wanting to clarify whether that was just a conversation outside of the rack or if that's intended to be a conversation in the rack. I just maybe I'm not tracking at this point.
Yeah, I'm not at this point. I'm not tracking because I'm not frankly sure what is possible outside of the official public meeting context, and what, if anything, we can do besides maybe some email iterating. So I do need to talk with Eric about that. And then we'll update all of you because I'm sensitive to, it's one thing to add a fifth meeting. We probably should avoid adding a sixth meeting. So anything we can do to do some legwork in between will be helpful. So I think with that, Eric, do you think it makes sense to go ahead and do the fiscal and racial equity impacts discussion now? Or hold that to another meeting? I'm not sure groundwater significantly changes that, whether it's in or out in the form of guidance, but what do you think?
Well, I'm actually leaning more towards having this at the next. So we're going to have, I think, one more meeting, what I'm hearing. I think this would be a good one to have maybe towards the beginning of that next meeting to give people an opportunity just to kind of reflect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So given this, we will do some internal research on what is and is not possible outside of a public meeting. So we're not doing anything inappropriate relative to sunshine laws. We will send you all an update about that. And then we absolutely will need to schedule a fifth meeting. Eric Hartstein, I think that must happen in March to meet the July timeline, correct?
I think that's how we sketched it out.
Okay. So we will probably ask for something sooner than later. Maybe the first couple weeks of March for a 5th meeting.
And we'll be challenged by the competing with the wrap up of the legislative session. But yeah, I'll put some dates out soon.
Okay. And I think Sine dies the 8th. So starting March 9th, everyone should have lots more time on their hands. Okay. All right. So thank you just for your willingness to talk about these very complex and I don't want to say controversial because that makes it sound bad. It's just a topic with lots of different opinions. And it's really important that we get this out on the table because there are very real conversations happening about needs out there. And we need to make sure our board is prepared with the right information to help inform them on the potential for engagement or not on groundwater topics with our grant program. So just thank you for your good thinking and openness to conversations that include disagreements. So Eric, Brian, anything else we need to check in with folks about?
No, I think that covered it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. Percy, did you have something?
Oh, just agreed. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so folks, thanks for being along for a longer rack ride than what we were hoping for, but we really appreciate it. So we'll be in touch about next steps. Okay, take care, everyone.
Nice weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Yep.